dogs, everybody is...
That's it. I'm going to be upstaged by dogs, aren't I?
Does anybody need a glass of water?
I would love a glass of water too. Is there a small table we can use for? Yeah, but they will upstage, so that's the...
That's all right. She would be running up and down and jumping around. And I always get dog envy when I see a calm dog.
I would love to have
Thank you very much.
But I have difficulty this evening. It wouldn't be fair.
Well, you know what? We can use our imagination.
I don't even have a real plan.
I'm just going to ask. I have one, but thank you.
You have Jonathan? You've got?
This is great. I'd have bought books to sell if I...
Are you
Jonathan, do you want me to stand downstairs for a
No, I think it's fine. Thank you. Yeah.
Yes?
Yes.
Well, I wasn't planning to make a grand entrance like that, but seeing as you were all seated, I'm delighted to be here with such a lovely group of people. And the reason we're a little bit late is that we just got a little bit overwhelmed with dinner time conversation and looking at gardens and talking about hedgehogs and Ukraine and nursing and all sorts of things that I hope we will cover today. But before we begin and I introduce our speakers, we need to start by acknowledging today. And I knew we were going to start by acknowledging that it was 9/11, which certainly for me, as someone who was in New York on that day, and actually, as some of you know, on my way to the airport that day, it's a day where I reflect. And it is a day of solemnity, but also gratitude. As many of you know, my cab driver took me home, and I spent the night in his house. Marconi, my Brazilian cab driver, who on that very, very dark day gave me hope that there were people who were filled with kindness and filled with hospitality, as opposed to what was unfolding in Lower Manhattan. So I was going to say a few things about 9/11, but of course, we are also in a period of national mourning. It did occur to me, is it appropriate for us to be holding this event this evening? Should we be canceling such things? And then I thought about the books that I've been reading and what I've been learning about each of our speakers, and I thought, oh no, what a tribute to our Queen. Because tonight we're going to speak about kindness, and we're going to speak about community, and we're going to speak about many of the values that she embodied. And so I suggest that instead of canceling this evening, we actually dedicate this evening to her memory and to what she believed in. And I did look up, because I remembered that she said something quite profound on 9/11. It was a message to the United States. And she didn't coin this saying, but she's the one who made it famous. And I had not realized until I looked it up earlier today, when she said, "Grief is the price we pay for love." She said that about 9/11. That was her message. And then she had her Changing of the Guards play the Star-Spangled Banner. What an extraordinary woman, and what a woman of grace and giving and kindness. So we will speak about her tonight. I'm going to do very little speaking because I have such amazing panelists. And I'm going to wave their books around while I talk about them. These are actually Jonathan's copies, but he gave them to me. I don't know if you're getting them back or not. Hugh Warwick wrote quite an extraordinary book. I'll let him speak about it in a few minutes. It's called Linescapes. And it's very much about the way we structure space, or how nature structures space when we give it the ability to do so. And he is truly the expert on hedgehogs. I don't have his hedgehog book here, but you can imagine. Oh, you have his hedgehog. There you go. There you go. But he is really a fascinating person to be having. I'll let him talk a little bit about his faith commitments or lack thereof. But as someone who finds deep meaning in nature and in communing with nature, you're certainly, you belong here and you're very welcome here.
Thank you.
Rabbi Jonathan, who needs no introduction at all other than to say that he and I always have this debate when we do these evenings about, I go, why do you need me? You've got all these Jewish stuff to say and all the relationships, and then he says, why do you need me? You've got all this. So we always sort of divide it between us in some way. And obviously, Jonathan, we want you to tie some of this together with the time of year that we're in. We are in Elul, the Hebrew month of Elul, leading up to Rosh Hashanah, leading up to this time of reflection and this time of renewal. So I hope you will add that Jewish dimension and that Jewish voice and help shape this conversation as one that can inspire us for the new year. And Christy Watson, who's my new best friend, we bonded over dinner as the parents of teenage girls. So some of you might want to join the club. I just read her latest book, The Courage to Care, which is very much about not just nursing and the commitment and kindness that comes from true nursing. My parents are doctors, and I'd always thought of nurses as medical professionals because my parents spoke so highly of them as medical professionals, but that's not what this book is about. Yes, there's medical expertise there, but that's not what nursing is, according to you. It is so much more than that. And I think the title of your first book really captures it, The Language of Kindness. So I hope you will bring some of that into this conversation. And my new friend, the bishop of, you're going to have to explain this a little bit for this community in terms of the Ukrainian church system has many different denominations. So in terms of the Catholic community in Ukraine, that has been your calling and your parish, although you arrived here right before lockdown. So in terms of trying to go out and meet your congregants, I'm afraid that you were limited to 2 dimensions of doing that. And yet you still managed to create community and navigate some quite complex issues around refugees and around helping people in terms of humanitarian aid. So I hope you will bring that into the conversation as well. Speaking of 2 dimensions, I know we have some people who are joining us in 2 dimensions. So we welcome all of you who are streaming, and I think we will we'll go ahead and dive in. Jonathan, did you want to say anything before we start?
I appreciate what you said.
So I think maybe we'll just start with each of you telling us a little bit about why you think you're here tonight. Right? Why did Jonathan invite you to come to a conversation about changing the world? Yes? Go for
Sounds
it,
good.
Hugh.
Okay, is it like sort of just a minute? I've got to just do it without
Just a
repetition,
minute.
deviation.
No repetition,
Yeah,
no deviation, no
Okay,
hesitation.
No deviation. That's going to be difficult. I'm here as your token atheist, but also so Jonathan reached out to me via the British Hedgehog Preservation Society, of whom I'm the
Wait a minute,
I am
he
going to
he
interrupt
said that
you for a
very
second.
quickly.
I
That
am
was
going to
the-
have to interrupt you for a second, which is, we had this series on Life on Earth the Jewish Way, and I needed an expert on mammals. So I get your number from the British Hedgehog Society. How am I going to explain that as a rabbi, I am ringing the head of the British Hedgehog Society, not even to deal with prickly congregants, but to ask? You immediately responded with what hedgehog is in Hebrew, which impressed me no end. Back to you.
Yeah, and then I discovered that what I put into my book as a joke was then said, that's actually a really inappropriate joke. So the hedgehog, Hebrew for hedgehog is kipod. Oh, is that said correctly?
Yes, that's
Kipod,
correct.
Kipod.
Yes, yeah.
And then I thought, it sounds like Kippur. So we have, instead of the Day of Atonement, we have the Day of the Hedgehog. So Yom Kippur, I was reckoning, would be the way forward. And then I was being pointed out that really, that's probably not. I think that didn't make it past the editor. So why am I here? I love nature. I love the natural world. I find great pleasure from being in it, and that's where I find a lot of my sort of rehabilitation comes from. And the book which you were showing there, Shoshana, was Linescapes. Is about the connections within nature. So the working title was the natural history of anthropogenic linear features. Looking, yeah, that's what my editor said.
Wait, no,
that was exactly.
I'm going to read you the table of contents and then you'll understand. Hedges, ditches, walls, canals, railways, roads. You get it? There's different
So
ways.
we have made a whole bunch of lines through the landscape, and what came from the book was essentially that the linear features that we have made specifically to fragment the landscape. So the hedges and the dry stone walls and things have inadvertently become the agents of connectivity for nature, and the things we've put in specifically for connection, such as the canals and the railways and the roads, have become agents of fragmentation for nature. And so it became an exploration of the ways that our natural world has been chopped up by us, and about how we can use the linear features which are there to aid the reconnection of ourselves with nature, as well as allowing nature to move around along those linear features as well. As to why I'm here, I actually don't know what's going to happen tonight. I mean, you sent me some ideas about what we were going to be discussing, and then you said you're not going to do any of that. So making the world better, basically I will be preaching along the lines of, what's the phrase that a friend of mine developed? He's described the moderate flank, the importance of the moderate flank. There we go. There's lots more, but...
Excellent, excellent. No deviation, no repetition. Well done.
And 2.5 minutes, it's fine.
Very good.
Well, thank you. Why am I here? I think it's, again, through kindness. When the invasion, full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia happened on the 24th of February of this year, very shortly after that, Rabbi Jonathan contacted me and invited me to come here and to participate in a Friday evening service, and asked if I would say a few words about what was going on and what we were doing here in London. And I thought, okay, I came up from central London where I live, and on the way I was thinking of all of the great smart things that I would say, and then I was attending the service. We were welcoming the Sabbath, and then Rabbi Jonathan asked me to stand up and talk, and I have to say, if you've known me at all, anybody who knows me knows that I'm not somebody that, is lacking for words, and I'm not saying that I'm not unemotional, but I'm not necessarily that emotional, and I couldn't talk. I was completely emotional, and in fact broke down and cried. And then Rabbi Jonathan invited me to his home for a meal, and showed me incredible kindness and let me know that I can continue with the work that I'm doing, both here as the Bishop for Ukrainian Catholics in Great Britain, and that I'm not alone. I had arrived here in the United Kingdom. As you can tell from my accent, I'm not from Cornwall. I'm from North America, from Canada. And I arrived, and my enthronement as Bishop of London for Ukrainian Catholics was 3 days before the first lockdown. And I really did feel alone during lockdown. But with Rabbi Jonathan and this community, I've not felt I've been alone at all since the invasion.
You're very welcome here.
Thank you.
Christine.
So you just described to me that 3 of the pillars of your faith are loving God, loving your neighbour, and then loving strangers. And I suspect that one of the reasons that Rabbi Jonathan so kindly invited me is the loving strangers part, to do with the nursing and my background, loving strangers. But in honesty, the reason I'm here is that I'm lucky enough to have many Jewish friends, and if anybody Jewish offers me food, I'm there. And that's the truth.
Well, that explains why you ended up at dinner. That doesn't explain why you're here.
No. That first chapter of your book, The Language of Kindness, when you describe walking through the hospital, the pressures on you as a nurse, and you find the time just to stop and listen to the story of a lady who's recovering from, I don't know what, she was blue and her circulation is back. And you describe, I hope you don't mind my saying this, how listening to her for a moment, you start seeing in this very elderly lady the young woman who fell in love during the war with a young soldier, and suddenly the whole human comes to the fore. That whole attitude is wonderful, and I asked the 3 of you and you, because this is what our world needs, and there's nothing I feel more passionately about or more anxious about at this time coming up to the new year than that these are the things our world needs, and we need to stand up for them. Yeah. So thank you.
My job is really to facilitate the conversation, so feel free to talk to each other as well as to me. But I think my burning question for all of you is really the same, and that is that it just feels like we're in a world where every time we pick ourselves up and push ourselves forward, we get hit with the next wave, right? And I feel like I used to feel as a child at the seashore when, and at that point I could hold my dad's hand, and he was so strong, and he held me. And whenever the waves would come, he would jump over them with me, and they didn't feel insurmountable. But I feel like we're in a world where the waves just keep on coming. And my question for each of you is, where's that hand that you hold on to as you keep tackling these waves? And you're each working in different areas, but each of you are getting hit by wave after wave. So can you just talk a little bit about what those waves are like in your world, and where do you get the hope, strength, resilience, whatever it is that my dad used to give me by holding my hand?
If I can jump in. Right after the COVID restrictions were lifted, I thought, well, now I can visit my various parishes throughout England. And then after my second jab, I contracted COVID. And I got really sick. And of course, I didn't have any family, and I don't want to say I didn't have any friends here because I was just making friends, and I landed up in COVID critical care unit in St. Mary's Paddington, and that's where I met incredible people who cared about me. The nursing staff there was just absolutely fabulous. The doctor, there was 4 of us in the room, and the nurses just asked me to have courage, to carry on, to have strength. There was a lady who was fairly well recovered, and she seemed like she was going to be discharged in a day or 2. She constantly looked over at me when we didn't have our masks on and were able to eat. She just kept saying, have courage, just think positive thoughts, Bishop, just think positive thoughts. And so where do I get that hand from? I would say that in my life I see that God has sent people to me whenever that wave comes, and either I recognize that hand of God in people like the nurses, the people who were keeping our room clean, the doctor that came. I have to say I gained almost 2.5 pounds in the hospital. The food was incredible. Every morning they would come with a menu with pictures in it, and I became addicted to something in the hospital though.
Custard?
Rice pudding. I'd never had it. And so whenever I think of, I need a little bit of a helping hand, I go to one of the shops near my place, and have some rice pudding, and I think of all of the wonderful people in the critical care unit.
Of all of the answers that could have been given, rice pudding was not what I was expecting. But,
Addicted to it.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. I think your description of the waves is so right. And the thing that I've been reflecting on is that the waves have always been there. And perhaps the thing that shifted is our understanding that they are there and have always been there. And our understanding of the importance of that hand to hold, that perhaps we didn't give enough significance to before we realised that the waves were always there. And I went back for a very short time to COVID intensive care to work clinically as a nurse, and I ended up as the lead nurse for compassionate care, and we were told our duties were to save as many lives as possible. And of course, especially in the early days during the first peak when I was clinical, we didn't save anywhere near as many lives as we wanted to or hoped to. And compassion became the central thing. It became the only thing. Compassion for staff, for families, for patients, for relatives, for each other. And I began to realise that compassion is the thing that history will judge us on. It's the thing that history should judge us on. And compassion for me felt like that hand with whoever is on the other side of it, whether it's nature, whether it's your God, whether it's your faith, whether it's your neighbour, whether it's your rice pudding. But I felt like one of the jobs that I had was to manage the chaplaincy. So I almost had the opposite of what you had, in that I was working with some people from every faith you can imagine who were providing us with the hand and providing the patients and the relatives with the hand. And managing the chaplaincy, the multi-dominational chaplaincy in a meeting was not easy, I won't lie. It's probably the most difficult aspect. But I felt like that having the hand could come from any direction really, and sometimes it could be like an umbilical cord and flow in both directions.
Mm.
See, I think my hand comes from anger to some extent, because the waves aren't natural, most of them. The waves have been created by other people. And the more you become aware of the creation of those waves, who's creating those waves and why they're creating those waves, that drives me forward. So in terms of coping with the wave, now interestingly, how do I cope with it? I will go to waves if I get a chance to watch them, because I love watching the movement of water, whether it's the river running through Oxford where I live, or whether it is on those rare chances I can get to the coast. But I find, the American writer Stephen Jay Gould, he said, "We will not fight to save what we do not love." And we can go around liking stuff, we can go on social media and like stuff, we can be half-hearted about it. But I believe we need to fight. And my passion and my love is the natural world. I use the hedgehogs as my gatekeeper species. It is not necessarily a very positive emotion, but that's where I find that strength comes from.
I'm so glad you raised that, because I'm curious about the relationship between righteous anger, kindness, rice pudding, but I'm also thinking about this time of year, and particularly Sukkot, and how we're leading up to the holiday of Sukkot, which is all about fragility, and leaning into fragility and accepting that, we live in a fragile world. So that was my association. I don't know what yours is, Jonathan.
Well, when you said wave after wave, a biblical scene came to my mind, which we read about this year, which is Jonah in the whale says exactly that. He says, all your waves are passing over me. And then Jonah gets spat out on this hostile territory, where he has to go and proclaim something which people don't want to hear. And in the end, what gets challenged is not the people there, it's his own capacity for compassion. So in a way, there's something there about fighting. And I never thought of myself as a fighter, but I've become one the older I've got, and I feel really, really strongly about it at the moment. But ultimately, it's a test of our capacity for compassion, I think. The other thing I wanted to say is that the hand is sometimes a paw.
All the small claws of a robin, actually, I find.
Yeah.
Yes, a small robin landing on your hand. If you don't have a dog and you've got a small garden, tame a robin to come and feed from your hand. That's pretty much as good as a hedgehog, but just don't tell any hedgehogs about that.
I want to stick with anger for a second and turn to this side. Tell me about anger in your work. What's the role that it plays or doesn't play? Did that resonate, what Hugh was saying?
Yes, I think so. I mean, anger is one of our emotions, and uncontrolled anger is destructive, and righteous anger can produce positive effects. How can we look at what's going on in the world, in different parts of the world, here in the United Kingdom? If we're not having a controlled anger, it just means that we could become uncaring. I don't care. It's not my people. It's not my world. I'm okay. Don't bother me. I'm not going to bother you. We often think about, when we're talking, on a term of ecumenism or relations with other faith groups, the worst thing that we could say is, for me, ecumenism or interfaith dialogue is, you mind your business and I'll mind my business, and we'll just get along really well. And when I was a student in Rome at one of the pontifical universities, we had this fabulous American professor called Father Charlie Angel, and he said, if you're studying interfaith and religious dialogue, and the fact that we are not recognizing that we are all children of God, and that we maybe don't talk to each other enough, if you're happy with that, then you should leave this class, because it's only when we feel that wound and we say, this isn't how we were supposed to live, this isn't how we were created by a God who loves us, then you're not going to reach out, you're not going to see the other, and you're not going to feel angry in the positive sense about injustice.
It's really fascinating. The I was trying to think about what is the opposite of anger is apathy, right? And the opposite of caring is apathy.
Yeah, and I think apathy is the most dangerous of all emotions. And the word compassion comes from the Latin compassione, which is to suffer with. But the word suffer comes from to feel keenly. So anger is to feel keenly, righteous anger. And it's the opposite of apathy, is compassion. And so I think anger definitely has a place, not all anger.
No, not a slight.
Yeah.
I mean, the closest I get to skirting around religious issues is I had a Quaker wedding. I made films with the Quakers, done lots of political work with the Quakers, and very much one of the best lessons I had sitting with the Quakers as we made this film called Nonviolence for a Change was every conversation you have with everybody you disagree with you should leave it at such a point that you could have a cup of tea next time you see them. And I on the whole, I have this idea of the bell curve of sort of political discourse and the bell curve of how we feel about most things. And if you go back to your basic science, it's the normal distribution curve, literally a bell curve. And at either end, you've got outliers, people who feel very, very strongly about things in such a way as maybe to be troublesome. But most people actually aren't. And in fact, spending 5 years in the Church of England's Magdalen College chapel as a chorister parent and having gone to Evensong an awful lot. Having insisted, in fact, on reading lessons, but only when they refer to hedgehogs, because there are references, obviously, to hedgehogs in the Bible. And the great thing about that was the congregation then didn't actually know whether I was making it up. Anyway, so but 95% of the stuff, everything that we hear and everybody, all of the basic things we agree on. Within that bell curve, we all tend to agree on it. It's if we spend our time focusing on those bits that we disagree on, that's when it all falls down. And I have to say, and this is where I'm treading on very thin ice here, but it strikes me that often it's religious communities who will tend to occupy those outlying spaces and insist on things which are without the bell curve. And I just wonder about that in terms of compassion and connectivity, how having extreme views on either end plays into that and how it can be worked around.
You made me think, it doesn't quite relate to the extreme views, but the outside of the bell curve. One of the rabbis loved to play with words and often created acronyms out of them. And the Hebrew month of Elul, they took the letters and they relate them to verses in the Bible. And one of the verses where the initial letters relate is God will open your hearts and the hearts of your children. And in a way, that's what religion's for. I mean, so capable of abuse, unfortunately. But I was wanting to actually turn to you, Christy, and just ask you how there's such openness of heart. In your book, The Courage to Care, you describe different kinds of nursing. Military nursing, community nursing, district nursing. Prisons. I'm just curious a bit more in how that opened your heart and whether you're able to say that and how you see it, overseeing nursing, just affecting people and touching people and where their strength comes from.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot since the Queen died.
Are you okay to
Yeah,
go
I'm
shower?
sorry.
Sorry.
Speaking quieter and quieter. I'm not normally quiet. But I've been thinking a lot since the Queen died about duty and having a calling, and whether in any way Her Majesty was influential on any of my colleagues or myself in how we approached work, which was sacrificial to some part. And I spoke to my friend who's a Queen's nurse today, and she felt this devastating sense of loss of a figure who was so full of humility and grace and all the things that we loved about the Queen. But I think also she felt like perhaps having somebody in our minds and hearts throughout our lives to emulate in the sense of that duty and calling and loving strangers, perhaps did influence nurses in a great way. And in the Courage to Care, a lot of the nurses I talk about are actually Queen's nurses. They're from the Queen's Nursing Institute. And they really work with, in some of the most difficult circumstances you can imagine, with some of the most difficult people you can imagine. And I've been lucky enough in my career to work with mostly people who are just incredibly grateful to be looked after and quite easy to look after. But some of my colleagues work with people who, frankly, are difficult to look after and difficult to love, and on the fringes of society and incredibly vulnerable, but hurt people, frighten people, and these are those people that they're working with. And so I've spent probably the last decade trying to rack my brains and think about why is it and what is it that makes people nurse. And nursing, I think, is a faith in itself. It's universal, it's global, it's been around forever and will continue to be around forever. And it is a kind of faith and belief in human beings regardless, indiscriminate. And I know nurses who have great Christian faith. I know Jewish nurses, nurses who are Catholic, nurses who believe in vodka and tonic, nurses who have no faith whatsoever or only believe in science, or, you know, there's a whole mixture, but they all have this connection. And I think it's about, I hate to use the word calling because my colleagues do hate that, but I think there is something about duty and a calling. And I've definitely been reflecting on that in the last 48 hours since the Queen died, because it feels to me that is the glue that holds nursing together, is these people from all walks of life are giving themselves indiscriminately to strangers who may be difficult, because they love strangers and they can love people in that way.
It's striking to me, and I don't want to put words in people's mouths, but my instinct from having dinner with all of you is that each of you have been called in some way to do the work that you do.
That's how we can get away with being so low paid.
There's a wave.
And I'm thinking about the sound of the shofar, which we blow, the ram's horn, which we blow in this entire month. And no one's quite sure why we do it. Okay, one of the things I've learned about Judaism is that when there's multiple explanations for something, it means we have no idea. And there's so many explanations for the shofar. But there is something about the primal sound of it that I know for myself when I hear the shofar being sounded. I am listening for that calling and that question of what am I meant to do?
So I find the interesting idea of a calling, obviously that's not a term I would use, but I sort of look at nature and nurture. And I'm in the interesting position of being able to assess both quite equally, because I was adopted at the age of 10 weeks, and then 20 years ago met my biological mother. And my adopted parents had a very keen idea about me joining the army, the city, or the church. So I went to Green Common, became an atheist, so it didn't work out. And then when I first met my biological mother, right from when she was at school, her nickname had been Badger, and she is a gardener. She is in love with nature. She is in love with the soil, in love with growing, in love with nurturing. And my biological father, who I'd never met, was a campaigner. And so in terms of calling, I say, yes, some of us have that calling very much thrust upon us through our genes. And it's very, very clear. I have this direct link to a bunch of people who are quite like me, and they're not the people who brought me up.
Fascinating. Thank you. It's certainly something that I think is or should be at the forefront of all of our minds right now during this month of Elul. Well, what am I being called to do over the next year? And I mean, I've always wished that God would come and just sort of tell me clearly, at 3:42 next Tuesday, please be at this intersection and your purpose in life will be given to you. and it's never quite that simple.
But Kenneth, did you always know that this was your calling?
No, actually, I can honestly say that when I finally told family and friends that I think I'd like to study to become a priest, they thought, come on, we know you like joking, don't joke about stuff like that. And I think that for me it was an awakening that I had done all sorts of things that I didn't think had anything to do with ordained ministry. I mean, after I graduated from school, I went to college to study advertising and public relations. Who knew that that might be handy as ordained minister? I worked in that industry for a while, and then I decided to leave that, and I became manager of a fast food restaurant called Chicken Delight. Don't cook tonight, called Chicken Delight. If the Colonel had our recipe, he would have been a general.
Did you write that
Wait,
one?
was
Is
that your advertising?
I wish that was the firm. But I think what ended up happening is all of my employers, they would always say to me, have you ever thought of the priesthood? You're Catholic, and I would say, why are you saying that? And they would talk about, you know, that I don't just seem to be a business person, and I'm not just an advertising and public relations person. Why don't you do something more meaningful? And then the short long of it is that my mother's cousin was a Catholic nun, or is a Catholic nun, and there was no internet in those days or anything like that. Every week I would get a letter from her saying, Kenneth, you should think of the priesthood. And she would send me this book to read, that book to read. And I think everybody finally wore me down, and I said, okay, I'll try it. And so I think, I can't say I woke up one day and heard the voice of God, but I think it was a gentle, gradual, you might be on this road and you might want to come here and do that. And I think that what Rabbi Jonathan referred to as, and you as well, is opening of the heart. I think it had to do with that.
There's a relationship, isn't there,
Yes.
Jonathan, in terms of opening the heart and being able to hear?
I mean, you just reminded me of the line my grandma came out with when I got my smicha, my ordination, which is, we'll wait and see what he does when he grows up. But yeah, I mean, one of the things I find is that the people, most of my inspiration comes from my community, because the people I meet, they challenge me, but they also open my heart. I mean, you must find that just over dinner, because you could translate. Our Ukrainian family explained that there's been bombing and water, electricity and all services are cut off where their husbands are.
Right.
You must have that 20 times a day at the moment.
It happens, and I think, like in the medical profession, you can hopefully not become glib about that, and every time you hear something or see somebody who is ill and in need, you just don't say, oh yes, I know what your situation is, I've seen that all the time. Every person is an individual, and I think for me over the last 6.5 months or so is when I've encountered somebody who has had to flee harm's way, whether it's been from Ukraine or anywhere that I'm meeting people, is not to say, oh yeah, I know what you need, and you know, and here it is, go off now, but really to try to hear what they're saying. And it was clear from our meal this evening that the two people who you're hosting, I mean, can you imagine yourself just at dinner saying to somebody, oh, my neighborhood is just, there's a bomb been dropped there, and my family doesn't have any water or electricity, and could you pass the cabbage, please? They needed to say that, clearly. And I think we need to look at, whenever we see and hear things, how is that affecting them? How will that affect them this evening?
I'm quite touched by this question of language, because one of the things you did at dinner was you spoke their language, literally. And so there was I could just feel their connection with you. But I think also, in your book, the language, it's not a verbal language in nursing. Sometimes it is. But you wrote so poignantly about the way that when a community nurse goes into someone's home and all of the data that they're taking in to assess the situation while, just making a cup of tea. And that cup of tea is a kind of language, and all of the data that's coming in, and the language of nature as well, and the language of the shofar. And I'm just thinking of all of these different languages that allow for the heart to be opened, and how often I just walk straight past something and don't hear the language that's being spoken because I'm late, or because I'm busy.
You need to borrow a toddler. That just is, in terms of the language of nature, that is the greatest thing. Or find somebody small who will see things from a slightly different perspective. That's less so, because then you're just constantly waiting to find out what they're eating and where they're doing. But in terms of just going out into nature and getting a slowing down of your time in nature, and certainly during Linescapes, I was very much exploring that idea along the linear features of spending time in them, and actually the closer you get to it, the more you become sort of attuned to what's going on in there. And it's
the hedges. When you talked about the hedges, 200-something species in this little hedge, and it was about getting down.
So 2,000 species
Sorry,
of
2,000. Okay, I
sorry, but in terms of just one small bit of hedge.
It was huge. But what struck me was getting down at the level of the hedge.
And it's the fact that, the language, the human languages, whether they are through touch or through compassion or through literally different languages, are relatively straightforward. But then there is this other language of what there is out there. And there is an entire non-human world, which is, in many instances, fully sentient and fully in need of as much compassion as any human beings. But they don't have the same level of capacity to communicate with us unless we're willing to get down to literally down to their level, and be willing to listen to what it is that they are saying. And I'm becoming the book I'm currently writing, I keep finding I moved out of third person to the first person to talk about non-human animals, just because it feels like we have pushed everything away into other. The more we can other anything, the easier it is to dismiss it. So we would other people of different faiths, people of different skin colours, people of different countries, now of different species. Let's stop othering and let's start embracing. Let's open up to that.
I think one of the things that struck me when we were talking earlier even, and your understanding of nature, I grew up on a farm in rural prairie Canada, and I don't know if any of you have experienced prolonged weeks of -40.
I grew up probably close to that farm.
In Saskatchewan.
Alberta, so
Okay.
actually I don't know which one's colder.
Well, so you know what I'm about to say. So I grew up on the farm, and our closest neighbor was about a mile away. And when it's -40 and you don't have good relationship with your neighbor, you're in trouble. Especially if the closest hospital is 2 hours away and the closest grocery store is that far away. And so you have to understand relationship, you have to understand relationship with nature as well. You can't discount nature. Nobody's going to come and rescue you if something happens. And so you have to be good with nature, you have to be good with... My dad, refused to level all of the trees on our farm. And he said, well, we need that to protect the soil, we need that to keep the water level out. Unfortunately, my older brother and my younger brother and myself, we didn't want to live on the farm and didn't become farmers, and my dad ended up selling our farm, and I haven't been back to Canada since I arrived 2.5 years ago, and my younger brother, who lives in Calgary, drove past it, and the people or the company that bought it has totally leveled it. I mean, there's not a tree on it. And it just broke my heart because those bushes that we had, those bluffs, were important for us. We saw the nature. We saw birds' nests. We saw caterpillars eating the trees on the leaves on the trees. And you understood that. You don't maybe see that so much in a big city.
I was thinking, you mentioned, we've got the image of seeing and of hearing, and I was thinking of the hearing, and the twice daily, most basic sort of, it's not even a prayer, meditation of Judaism is Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And we tend to regard that as, listen to the following proposition, God is one. But to the mystics, that's not what it means at all. It means listen to life, and in everything you hear the presence of God, the oneness of God. Be it, I mean, you describe, I mean, I think you mentioned this earlier, Shoshana, the amount of information a nurse going into a house absorbs almost subconsciously, and it's massive, and the attentiveness that you all describe, and in a way the beauty I find in that approach is find that the oneness. It's not a simplification down. It's a sense that my life too is part of that same oneness. And late last night, Nikki and I followed the program of the Queen's homemade pictures and videos, which she narrates. And one has the sense that she knew she was dying, either literally or that her life was coming to an end. And as a person writes a love letter to their family afterwards, she wrote this to the country. And you sense the humility of that connection with life. And, well, yeah.
I'm just interested, so is that right, Christine, in terms of the connections you make with and have made with people through nursing? Jonathan, at the beginning you mentioned, Shoshana, about the Queen, what she'd said, but I've talked about that idea of grief being just crucial because it's proof that was love. I mean, it's just so important to have that. How do you keep yourself together when you are so? Cause I'm exposed to natural loss all the time. That's one of the great disappointments of being an ecologist at this moment, is that you are constantly being exposed to that loss, and constantly, because I am committed to loving it, I'm constantly exposed to grief. But in a sense, it's almost more acute when you're dealing with people on a constant basis. And same with you, Kenneth, when you're dealing with your communities in Ukraine. How do you maintain the walls that stop you crumbling? I mean, because that's where I find myself. I find myself at the edge of crumbling. And I was wondering how you cope.
And I'll enhance that a bit more, because Jonathan, you talked about opening the heart, right? But if you're saying, but if you're too open,
You crumble.
then you can't function. And yet, if you close down, then you other, right? And you're distant. How do you? It's a very, very fine line there. How do you navigate that fine line?
I haven't worked clinically for a while, but I did work clinically for 20 plus years. And I think when I started out nursing, the walls were really important. And so I would hide behind language. Medical language and jargon is such a beautiful place to hide. And you don't have to think too much about suffering when you're using Latin words and confusing yourself as well as everyone else. And then I imagined nursing to be about biology and chemistry and cracking chests and resuscitation. And it took me years to understand that nursing is about those things, but it's mostly about listening and opening your heart and allowing walls to crumble, actually, and being human and sitting in someone's suffering with them, which is really hard. It's really hard. But that's what the job is, and that's what helps people. And a few years ago, a friend of mine got diagnosed with grade 4 colon cancer, and she was only 34. And because she was a professor, the doctor that gave her the news said, you have this amount of chance of survival, your prognosis is this is the data linked to this is the latest clinical research, and you probably have 3 months to live. And she was gut punched, absolutely gut punched, and said, you better hold my hand when you give me news like that. And you'd better speak in a way that I can understand. And you'd better look me in the eyes. Because all those statistics that you gave me just mean nothing, and all they've done is created a wall between us. And so I think I changed my mind about walls, and I think the crumbling walls are really important, actually, but that's the hard bit. And the proceduralists want the walls, because they can hide there. But the really good doctors and the really good nurses are the ones that let you see them cry too, I think. And it's quite a radical perspective. Not everyone thinks the same as I do, but I think I would be very happy with somebody expressing emotion with me in that space. And I don't know how you feel.
I think that we do have to have some kind of wall. If I can't minister to somebody and break down and cry and say that, but at the same time, you have to have somebody that you can go to. You have to have your own rabbi, you have to have your own priest, you have to have your own friend, you have to have somebody who can slap you up the side of the head and say, you know, really, I think that's a little bit too much here, or, you know, hug you without having to say anything. And just to follow up on, you know, when I was admitted to the COVID critical care unit, the doctor who I had, she was exactly the opposite of that. Although she knew I was a bishop and a man of faith, she said to me, and she was holding my hand and looking me in the eyes, and I was very, very sick. And she said, Bishop, you are very, very sick. I can't tell you what's going to happen. We're going to make you as comfortable as we can, but we're here for you, and we're going to fight with you and for your life, but you have to do that as well. But she said, if you have to make some amends, you should do them now. And I was so touched by what she said.
That's real courage, actually. I love her.
I can tell you what her name is later. I mean, and I think as a person in ordained ministry, we have to not give a rote response. You know, we can't say, well, I'm sorry for your loss, because that's what we hear everybody say. If we're going to say, I'm sorry for your loss, we should mean it. And so you're right, we can hide behind terms, we can hide behind words, we can hide behind what we were taught in seminary, etc., but unless we say it with meaning. But the crumbling part is important. If you've not crumbled, then you've put up too many walls. But you do have to have the appropriate person that you can go to, who can either hug you or, again, slap you up the side of the head and say, really?
Just checking, is that actually part of Catholic ministry that you get that?
We're not supposed to do that anymore.
Just simply remind, just 2 words are going through my mind from the liturgy. They both begin with the same Hebrew letter, the bet, the letter B. And they're the words that kind of, I feel them quite a lot during the year, but they get me at this time of year. The Day of Atonement contains confessional prayers, and the short form is just a series of verbs, and the second verb is we've betrayed. And I feel that so deeply with regard to the world of nature, that it's betrayal. And the other word is boshnu. We're ashamed. I feel ashamed. And those 2 feelings of being part of a species that betrays, we betray each other, and the world of nature and the sense of shame.
So I would say that
that one
betrayal,
feels.
you need to have knowledge to have betrayal. And I think it's worse than that. That's the trouble. I mean, to betray nature is to have an appreciation and a knowledge of what you're actually doing. We have gone one step beyond that, and it's now ignorance and dislocation. So the betrayal is almost by the side. I mean, that's my, I suppose, my absolute, the biggest split we've had as a species came when we got confused over the ancient Greek word oikos, which means home. And we got confused, of course, ecology, which is the study of home, and economy, which is the management of home. And ecology got forgotten. And you have got this obsession with economy, an obsession with the management of a thing which we don't study, we don't understand, and we don't care for. And so we look at making the world better, which we were sort of talking about this. I find that right at the heart of this is the fact that we do not give the appreciation, the love and the care to ourselves and to the natural world, because we're obsessed with something which is impossible, which is continual growth on a finite planet, idiot, and ignoring the ecology, which is the actual study of what's going on. And I find, it feels that the faith groups, everybody should be embracing that as a way forward. And I know from talking with you, this is something which is close to you, but it feels that not so many people find that absence significant, and so that level of ignorance is what I think hurts me even more than betrayal.
Sorry.
Well, I'm aware of time, and I want to make sure that we go back to the title of our session tonight, which is about making the world better, and that involves change. And again, this is the time of year when we're going to spend a lot of time sitting in synagogue thinking about change, and whether, well, the book of Jonah ends with a question, and the question is change possible? Can we really change? Right? Weren't we sitting here last year saying the same words, asking the same question, dedicating ourselves to being better, and yet we're back here again? And so I think the question that really hangs in the high holidays is change possible? And I want to ask each of you, perhaps to as we draw to a close, to share a story that hopefully answers that with a yes. A story in your experience where you have seen change, where change has actually happened. And it doesn't have to be a huge change, but it needs to be a significant change. Something that we can think about and that can inspire us to indeed make some of the changes that we're going to be committing to. You can say pass if you can't think of anything, but I'm hoping that there are stories in the work that you do. Certainly you're working with, in a horrific situation of a war zone with refugees. You're working in terms of people who are suffering and ill, some of whom are not going to be healed, and yet you are present with them. And you're working with ecology, with the world, with nature, which is constantly changing. And Jonathan, you're working with this community.
You should have heard what he said over dinner.
Where have you seen change, that change is possible, and we should not give up all hope of change being possible?
Okay, I can give you one, which is me. So one of the questions you floated, Shoshana was very generous in suggesting some questions you might ask, of which you haven't asked any, which is correct. And one of the questions you suggested was what would your younger self think? How would they feel about you now? And I was saying one of the things I'd really love to do is to go back in time and place a bet with my younger self about whether I would ever appear on a platform with two rabbis, a bishop and a professor. And I'd have made a fortune out of that one. But actually the change for me when I was younger and I'd sit in front of bulldozers at Twyford Down or Newbury bypass protest, only briefly because I'm quite small and I get angry. But the life was actually quite simple. And because there was right stuff and there was wrong stuff. And the change which has come over time for me is, so when I talk about the bell curve, yeah, I was always on the correct end of the bell curve, but I was on one of the ends of the bell curve. And everybody else was wrong. And now I really begin to see the importance of trying to understand more about the body of the bell curve. And I mean, I do a bit of stand-up comedy, and one of the things I was doing, on stage recently and doing a thing, and it ended up with the idea of the Women's Institute actually marching on Parliament, marching down Whitehall, singing Jerusalem, swinging jars of marmalade and jam, and it was just, yeah, these are the people I'm trying to sort of work with. And so I feel that yeah, from a personal point, that has been one of the most significant things, is a willingness to appreciate that possibly, just occasionally, maybe I'm not always right.
Thank you. Thank you. And it's actually, it's funny, Hugh sort of said, what are you going to ask me at this thing inside of a synagogue, a place of faith? So I sort of just sent you some questions off the, you know, off the cuff, just to kind of, you know, show you that we weren't going to do any satanic rituals or anything here. Those happen after. But it's actually quite a good question, isn't it, for the high holidays, and for us to think about, what would my younger self think of who I've become today? And what are the changes that have happened in me? And that is very inspiring to just think back to, well, yes, I have changed. And therefore change is indeed possible. And then maybe as we're sitting in shul, what were those interventions that helped me to make that change for the positive? Thank you for that.
So, yes, I believe change is possible. I worry about whether collective change at a pace that's necessary is possible, and I'm worrying about whether we're getting the leadership that is going to take us to those places, or whether actually there's too much fear. But on a personal level, I can think of several things, and they're very small moments that have so stuck with me. I mean, I'll mention one which is really quite personal, which is walking along with a colleague, Richie Hammerman in Israel, lovely, lovely man in New York, and saying, I regret not having given enough time because of work and career to the children when they were younger. And he just said, there's always teshuvah, which means repentance. And it's just so stayed with me. The other thing I'll say is that I think when I was in my teens and 20s, I had so many reasons for not doing things. And I put that down partly to Nikki, for my wife. I've always got reasons for yes doing things now. That's really changed for me. But I worry about whether collectively we can carry our society to be reflective enough and change enough in time. And that's where I think the righteous anger is important.
Well, over the last 6 months, especially in the first 2.5 months after the invasion, if I wasn't giving an interview with some newscaster at least twice a day, I would go through withdrawal pains. And one of the constant questions was, what can we do here about the war in Ukraine, and what our leaders should be doing? And I had an opportunity to reflect on that. I think my first answer to that question was kind of off the cuff, and then the more I thought about my answer, it was, we want our leaders to be people who promote peace in the world. We want our leaders to, make peace where there's aggression, that they would be these negotiators, and they would be known as, peacemakers. But where did these leaders come from? They came from families, and there's no peace in our families, there's no peace on our streets, there's no peace in our communities, but yet all of a sudden we elect somebody and we say, you have to make peace. So for me, the change is in my own family, and when I talk about my community, unless we are families of peace that promote peace, I'm not saying that we let anything go, but how do we promote peace in our families? How do we promote peace in our neighborhood, our community? And if we do that, we are going to have leaders that come from communities of peace, and there will be a change. And I think in terms of ecology, and I'll make something personal, up until about 15 years ago, when I would brush my teeth, I would let the tap run. And then somebody told me how much water every year went down the drain because I was brushing my teeth and didn't turn the tap off. And I think that there's probably a lot of people now who have turned the tap off when they brush their teeth. And that's change, and that's collective change. How big of a dent that has made into saving our planet, I don't know, but I think I've saved a lot of gallons of water over the last 15 years.
Thank you. I think collective change is possible, and quick collective change is also possible, because when the pandemic first happened, almost overnight, we had a change, or a seeming change, in values, where communities were coming together. People were out on the streets. Everyone was looking after their neighbours and thinking about other families as well as their own families. People were delivering food parcels. They were checking on people who were shielding. And there was a real sense that we'd moved away from this isolationism and division and anger and hatred that we had got sucked into. And of course, it was very short-lived. And the collective change happened really quickly again. And people turned inwards and closed their curtains and started thinking about their own trauma and their own grief, because it was too much. And the news was awful in every direction, with awful, terrible wars and existential threats to humanity. And it's so overwhelming to think about that I think the apathy problem became a real issue, a very dangerous state that we were all in. But I agree with the bishop. I think that though it's in the small actions, Rabbi Jonathan said as well, I think that we can individually affect community change. And it is about those small kindnesses that we see around us that are going on all the time. And as much as the world seems like it is full of waves, there are so many beautiful, kind and compassionate things happening all the time, that perhaps those are the things that need amplifying, because they don't make headline news, that Daniel's running a food bank, or that someone else, all these things are going on all the time. And I think that change collectively can happen when we really value and amplify those quiet people that are going about their business and just doing beautiful things without any fanfare. And for me, I think that gives me hope, for sure.
Can I just, what time do you actually have to finish? Is it?
Well, I think what I'm going to do is close and then invite people to continue chatting. And I'll pick up on what you said in order to close, which is that each of you spoke about small things. And the question of whether that's sufficient, whether we have enough time to do the small things. But it does boil down to individuals taking those actions. And I just want to thank each of you tonight for being here. In a sense, it's a small action. It's one evening, right? Don't want to minimize the trouble of coming down and doing this.
Yeah, it was a hellish thing.
But I know that it's these kinds of evenings that build relationships. And the connection that I feel now with each of you, and the connections that have been made here, and the way that this community, who are going to be spending a lot of time together, over the next few weeks. This is a very intensive time of prayer and reflection and really considering what is the kind of world that we're going to build together. You've made a difference. So I want to thank you all for being here this evening. I want to thank my rabbi in particular, who has an exquisite way of connecting to people and inviting them to be part of our community and making sure that we live up to those verses that I showed you downstairs, that this is not just a place where we love God and not just a place where we love our neighbor, but this is a place where we invite the stranger in so that they are no longer strangers. And that is the way that we express that love that we have. And I want to end this evening by quoting Queen Elizabeth. May her memory be a blessing. This was from her 2019 Christmas broadcast. And I think it's a very fitting way for us to end an evening where we're talking about changing the world for the better. She says, "It is often the small steps, not the giant leaps, that bring about the most lasting change." And so I share a collective prayer that it will be those small steps that we all take and commit to that will bring about the lasting change that our world needs. Thank you all so much. And thank you all for coming.
And thank you for facilitating.
And feel free for informal chatting, but for those of you who it's a school night.
And beware that this room is streamed.
Ah yes, anything you say will be heard.
You want to talk, if there's anything you feel you should better say downstairs.
Of course, yes, I should. Thank you. No, you're not going to escape that.
That was fantastic. That was your doing.
I basically follow food, money, wine, and cake. All combination.
Okay. Thank you for enabling me.
Well done.
Fantastic.
You're all brilliant. You're all brilliant. Shall we go back out? Yeah.
And a group of about 10 people.
See, you're getting there. Then again, I do all the WI talks, so it's down at the high. But no, I live in Oxford, so not much an easy drive. I don't actually have a job, so I'm in that situation where if there is some sort of compensation, it does help. But I have an awful lot of time. So much for some reason I thought this girl to 10, 15 minutes away. And so there's so much else. There was